Welcome to the CEO of Destiny podcast, where you will find the tools to fulfill the purpose of your generation and wildly succeed in the marketplace. And now your host, Andre J. Benjamin.
Our reading of history is that that's not true, right? And you know, two things tend to be true of socialism. One is that it has tended to lead to authoritarianism, right? And that, if I don't know why they're married in that way, but for whatever reason, socialism tends to be, just look at the history of Latin American countries, Cuba, et cetera, but other places it's been tried, tends to lead to authoritarian regimes. And the other is that it just simply does not produce goods and services that a society needs to be self-sustainable, right? Look no further than Cuba. It's probably the oldest and longest running socialist society.
There it is right there. It's a case study.
And if you go visit, and I will say this is secondhand because I haven't gone myself, but I've had several people say to me, if you go, bring your own food, like bring a bunch of bars. Like it doesn't matter how much money you have, there just simply isn't enough food to go around. And it's very eye-opening to sort of understand. And that's only one example. And if I were to give sort of the counter argument for just a second, yes. I think many people, not all, many people who describe their views as socialist kind of mean like a European style democratic socialism where there's a larger safety net, where government is even bigger.
It's more subsidized to a degree, but it's interesting because there's something that's masking. There's almost a hybrid capitalism within it, but it doesn't want to be called capitalism. That's a whole study within itself, because you're right. Sometimes I hear people describe something and they point to something and I go, well, that's not socialism.
Right. There's still markets. The markets still set the prices. It's not centrally planned, all of that kind of stuff. Yeah. And, I think, but I also look at what Mamdani says he's trying to do. I don't think he'll have the flexibility to do all that. But you don't solve affordability for housing by capping rents and then just, dissuading people from building. And there's a reason why Texas has falling home prices, and it's because it's a lot easier to build there. And I'm not saying zoning doesn't matter and that we shouldn't care about these things.
But it is something worth exploring, because we can't complain out both sides. We can't say, man, the prices continue to skyrocket, but then there's so much regulation that's not incentivizing for there to be building. We marveled at the fact that we moved out here. We've been in Washington State our whole life, and so we move out here to the southeast, and we had one of the schools that our children go to. They had a building project that they were beginning right when we arrived, and we saw it completed. And we were fascinated by that. We said, wait a minute, they started a project and they completed it. They're opening it up, and now people are using the building. I mean, we've seen things go on for seeming decades, and it makes small to nominal progress. So to see things come to fruition, and it really is astounding to us, even to see coming out of our neighborhood and to see pothole that was there gets fixed and gets filled. It's just different. And so on the backdrop of that, so I'm in the book, and I'm kind of doing a broad brushstroke, but I want you to kind of interact with this conversation. So when you talk about kind of the polarizing of in the ongoing discussion that has been going on since the time you wrote the book, it's almost people are insulated and they're in a homogenous community and social media echo chambers that is reinforcing their own biases. So what led you to take that dynamic so seriously, and what have you seen actually help people step out of those echo chambers in real life?
I don't think that I realized, Andre, just how much of a bubble I was in, right? I mean, I sort of was like, I'm centrist-ish, and I get, I look to other media and I'm interested in sort of what other people have to say. But I didn't even realize how much I was in my own bubble, and Elizabeth, I think, had the same experience. Look, everything's strength is its greatest weakness, and social media has democratized information in ways that are incredibly good, and it also has created these rabbit holes and these silos for people to exist only with media that they align with, and I think that's dangerous, right? And so we really tried hard to incorporate different voices, anyone really who would speak to us, or who had published, books or podcasts, things like that, and tried to include some of those ideas in the book. I think of the book as it's not a political book, right? I think of it as pretty centrist. There's a whole chapter on government and, sort of why we don't want an overreaching government. And sort of government's not, the chapter is called something to the effect of the government's not the solution, but it's not the problem either.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the flip. It's not the problem, but it's not the solution either. And I think it was important to address sort of people's views of this, right? I mean, we're talking about this question of like housing regulation and like you can't have no zoning at all, but you also aren't going to regulate your way to cheaper houses, right? You can't just say to people, okay, we're going to fix prices and prices will be lower.
People groups, the redlining and the, the policies that are not going to, it doesn't come across as so meritocratic for quite a few. So
absolutely. And I think at the end of the day, I think capitalism's real power is in allowing people to sort of make something of themselves. I think it's why the US has always been sort of this city on the hill that to parrot Reagan's language, but there's a reason why so many people from other countries have wanted to come here and continue to want to come here. This is a land of opportunity. But I also think we need to recognize this dynamism, which is the right word for it, of the US economy is starting to slip away. I mean, 50 years ago, if you were born in the bottom 25th percentile of wealth, you had about a 25% chance of dying in the top 25th percentile, easy to remember. Today, you've got a 5% chance, right? So you talk about meritocracy. We're sort of moving away from that, right? You are, and so there's a lot of reasons, the way we fund schools and just overall opportunity. But to me, that's a perversion of capitalism, right? Like what's best for our economy as a whole is to unlock human potential wherever it is. And I feel that, I mean, we talk about it in the New Builders, but we really talk about it in Capital Evolution, because I feel that, like, to my core, we want to strive to allow everyone to unlock their potential. That doesn't mean everyone's equal, like, at all, right? Like, that is not, and I don't believe in that sort of equality. No. I believe in equal opportunity. Different people are, by the way, born with different attributes, right? I'm there's certain sports I'm good at and some other sports that I'm not good at because I'm 5'9", right? Like, got it.
Yeah, and there's certain academic areas where you flourish and there's others where you struggle. And some
absolutely
have a natural aptitude for it.
And that's totally fine.
Uniqueness.
Yeah.
What would you say if you are, so now unpack this, because it's the dynamic capitalism is the premise of the book. Why don't you unpack and give kind of like your elevator pitch, that if you're in an elevator with 3,000 people, that's kind of fun.
Yeah.
And you're going up and you guys are going to, you've got 15 seconds before your next stop. How would you define this? Because you're pitching the idea of the book and why they should even take a look at it. What are you going to say?
Yeah, well, you've talked to me a few times. I can't do anything in 15 seconds, but I'll give you the quick pitch. Look, dynamic capitalism is a vision for capitalism that is still very capitalistic, but has 4 key sort of pillars that are different than neoliberalism. The first one is that dynamic capitalism takes a long-term view, not just a short-term view, and that short-termism has been a fundamental feature of neoliberalism. But by the way, it doesn't work, right? The half-life of a Fortune 500 company is 20 years. So it's not like these companies that are like shareholder are actually being successful at. So first thing is long-term view. Second thing is empowerment for an ownership economy, right? We want to create more capitalists in every possible way. One way, I want to give Trump some credit for this. I don't love the name of it, but these baby bonds that he's doing, these baby accounts, $1,000.
I had not heard of it. I guess I had stayed so much out of the news, but somebody told me about it recently, and it caught my ear because I hadn't heard of it, and I said, yeah. They said, these baby bonds. They said, did you hear about this? And they said, what do you think about it? I said, well, I need some time to think about it. But I said, it is interesting to think. But actually, it was my son, my 16-year-old, was actually more abreast of current events.
No, I'm glad he's paying attention, right?
About it, because they were saying they were kind of debating in school about, what is that fair? But what if they don't know what to do, how to invest it? And, but keep going.
Yeah, the implementation of it is probably not exactly how I do it. But look, we talked about this idea in the New Builders and again in this book, right? So I think that makes sense. So we want to create an ownership and empower an ownership economy and create more capitalists. So that's thing 2. Thing 3 is a role for government, but a limited role for government, right? We want to be careful about what we're asking government to do. That doesn't mean that government shouldn't exist or that whatever. We should have zero regulations. I don't think anyone believes that, right? We want our water, air, food to be safe, all that kind of stuff. But there's a challenge
Libertarians
of
would
being
say,
over it.
just leave us alone, though. That's what the libertarians.
Yeah, I mean, libertarians say that, but they don't actually want their food to be
No,
poisonous,
they
right?
don't.
And
No, they
companies to be able to dump sewage out the back door. So they're libertarian. And by the way,
That's
they
the
drive
point.
on our roads.
Absolutely.
Government has a role, even for libertarians. And then the last thing, and this is like crazy to have to say this out loud. We had sort of a three-legged stool for a while, and then some stuff happened in sort of the news, and we were like, we probably need to add this fourth idea. But the fourth pillar of dynamic capitalism is respect for the rule of law and its equal application, right? And I think we are flirting dangerously with crony capitalism. Elizabeth and I penned a New York Times op-ed about a month and a half ago that talked specifically about this, and that actually is not good, right? In order to have markets function effectively, I mean markets in general, not just financial markets, you have to have a set of rules that govern them, and people have to believe that those rules are applied and they're applied equally.
So let's unpack that a bit, Seth. So, and we'll have, of course, this is a robust conversation that we're going to continue on. But when you say, you guys, pin the op-ed about flirting with it, do you think this is new, or has this been present before? Because I mean, there are people who argue, and this is the kind of the distrust in institutions, is that people saw with the bailouts in 08, 09, that it was not, all businesses weren't created equal, right? It's like your buddies, hey, your sandwich shop, your sandwiches are trash, nobody likes them, we never get good service, the food's half cooked or whatever. Hey, we're going to reward you, and we're going to subsidize this, and we're going to say, not only that, you get a bonus and you get a payout for it, and we'll make sure that this never happens again because this is good for the whole. This is something that people experience with, and really gave the emergence of the the Wall Street, Occupy Wall Streets, even the emergence of, that's what the argument in the financial community with Bitcoin, and the emergence of Bitcoin in the white paper, is this idea of that people were seeing that people were taking care of. It's almost this uniparty taking care of their buddies, and it's saying forget the rest. And it's the same reason as to why we can see the enclaves of you look at the highest net worths, it's the cities that surround DC, where all the power is centralized. So it's disgusting for many, because they don't see how that points to meritocracy. And then they don't see it as that, I caution that the language, and I'm not saying you're saying that in your book. I'm asking that, since I have you here, to ask that question, that people push back and they go, well, wait a minute, it kind of makes it seem as if it's emerging now because of the right in office, or the populist in office, but this has kind of been an ongoing trajectory. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in the history of the world, it is always better to be closer to power, right? Like there's always some form of advantage there. And I think that, and that's gotten worse as, Citizens United, for example, I'd probably point to that as sort of the maybe the tipping point in the US. But what we talk about in that op-ed is Trump sort of taking it to a completely new level, where you actually need to know someone in order to get in business, for example. And that's sort of taking it to even sort of too far an extreme. I think you're absolutely right to point out the bailouts in 2008 and the GFC. I think that that's where this sort of rise of populism on both the left and the right got its energy, right? It was not a big movement really at all before that. And I think the fact that no one ended up being held accountable for what were clearly financial crimes in the way that they were operating their businesses, I think that was like a perversion of our economic system and of the law, right? And I think people looked at that, and I think everyone before that understood, of course, there are advantages to knowing people in politics and, getting stuff done both at the local, state, and federal level. And I think that just was the straw that broke the camel's back, to say, you know what, that like this system is fundamentally unfair. I lost my house and ruined my credit because these guys, sort of got me into this. And it
can't be tone deaf that there's been profiteering off products that don't benefit. So it's like, I'm going to call out from in my lifetime of being an adult. I'm going to call out Clinton. I'm going to call out Bush. I'm going to call out Obama. I'm going to call out Biden. I'm going to call out Trump. Like, I don't get the elephant or the donkey doesn't seem to me to give people a pass to operate, and then all of a sudden, like, the radar keys in on when my guy or my gal wins. And it seems tone deaf, because I remember we were in the barber shop. I think I talked about this in our first interview, maybe not, but we were in the barber shop after the 2016 upset when Trump won.
Yep.
And the barber who runs the shop, he's my barber. He goes, all you guys are in here talking about how you're so mad that Trump won. And he goes, the numbers aren't adding up. He goes, you guys in here, there's a bunch of you that voted for Trump.
That's funny.
He said, I just want to know, though, let's just have an honest conversation. He would just be like, why would people vote for him? And so another barber raised their hand and says, hey, I'll tell you why. And he was from Ohio, and he was talking about, he says, you guys, he said, when I moved over here to Washington State, he says, man, he goes, you could be unemployed for a year and you guys have all kinds of programs and things that help people with housing and this and that. He says, where I'm from, when those factories left, he's like, when you're broke, you're just broke. And he was breaking down to that you don't have, he says, for the most part, it was the first time my eyes opened up to the fact that there was a whole middle America that I had missed. It wasn't this coastal thing, this coastal reality that I was living in this coastal bubble of taking things for granted. He pointed out that a lot of people were dissatisfied. There's a bad taste in the people's mouths of how they see their industry gutted, and then they see the replacement with, kind of drugs and weapons and this idea of warfare, urban warfare, and then saying that there's a war. I mean, I even remember as a kid, and that's why I said I don't look at it as a Democrat or Republican issue. I look at it as crime families, and that's a whole nother issue. But just kind of that thought of, I like the fact that you're looking and you're examining a couple different roads. One of the things that stood out to me is how easily public debate falls into columns like capitalists versus socialists, elites versus populists, business versus government, black versus white. If economics is really about kind of how we steward the resources, the shared resources, how do we move beyond the us versus them framing and talk more about a comprehensive American approach to managing the resources?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that we do any. I mean, I'm an optimist, but that's a big leap from where we are. I think that I would love to see politicians that we're in a moment where we are governing via grievance, right? The politics of grievance, and it's really.
By the way, I love the way you guys coined that. That's
yeah. No, and it feels it's incredibly frustrating for me, because I think what happens is politicians on both sides, right? And we see this, I mean, obviously it's very obvious with Trump, but it's also pretty obvious with Mamdani and others. We look for someone to villainize, right? And we tell a group of people, factory workers that have lost their jobs in Ohio, or people living in New York who can't afford their houses. We identify a problem, which is a legitimate problem. Yeah, you lost your job. That sucks, right? You can't afford to live here, or you're never going to pay off your college debt. That's terrible. And then we tell them who to blame.
Yes. The
elites, the billionaires, the whatevers. They've rigged the system. The immigrants, the people stealing your jobs. But sort of giving examples on both sides. And we tell them that they should be angry, and that the people that will change that are me. I'm the politician that will do that, and I'm going to do that by taking from this group that has aggrieved you, and I'm going to give it to you, right? And whether that's your job because these people shouldn't even be here, or whether that's I'm going to take more money from these people and I'm going to basically give it to you in the form of whatever, free college, or paying off your college debts, or subsidized housing, or whatever it is. I think my hope is that we get past the politics of grievance. It's going to take a very special person to do that. Obama comes to mind in terms of his rhetorical style, right? His whole campaign was hope. Even Bush to some extent, right? Compassionate conservatism, but we're talking about people who were 20 years ago. I don't know who that is, because I don't really see anyone in the political landscape right now.
And I guess that's the question, is that I threw that question out there because I more push towards the individual sovereignty, and I push towards the power of the individual and, of course, the small business. I see that there's more of a role there of the Main Street role of your first book, and seeing because if we're always looking at this macro level and saying, we need someone to emerge from the same system which has produced this mess that we're in to now solve the problem. And I don't see it happening. So I do see these micro wins as something worth, looking at. So you argue that business now often wields more day-to-day power than government. If that's true, what responsibilities do business leaders have beyond their shareholders or core constituents toward the broader country, the nation that in which they're in, since we're talking about America?
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Do us a favor. If this was useful in any way for you, please go to iTunes and leave us a review. Reviews will allow others to easily discover the podcast. If you'd like more information and to receive a free download, Rediscover Your Destiny, go to ceoofdestiny.com. Thanks again, and tune in next time.